Once upon a time, I would find myself in hot water because I would make a statement in the presence of neurotypicals, and it would be to me an opinion, but I would be presenting it as a fact, or it would be interpreted as a fact because of the confidence with which I presented it. And as a neurodivergent person, I do have a tendency to be a little bit egotistical, and I'm using this term here in reference to Tony Attwood's Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome, which is one of the first books I read when I got diagnosed. And it was very helpful, and I picked up on that term, and I was like, oh, yes, I definitely experienced this. I'm what a friend of mine once said to me was solipsistic. I could only perceive my point of view as being the point of view, my subjective reality being an objective reality. And egotistical here is not a judgment. It's not implying that you're selfish. It's just that your view can be sometimes limited to the scope of what you see or you perceive. And this can be a universal human trait, but I've noticed as an autistic person, I have this native tendency to want to slide in that direction. Now, I presented it with confidence because in my mind, the statement I was making was based on numerous observations and the deductions I'd made based on those observations. And of course I had blind spots, things I missed. There might have been flaws in my perception. And I was aware of that. But being somebody who is cognitively rigid, who engages in binary black and white thinking, I needed a yes or no, one or the other answer. I didn't want to live in the gray. The gray was too intimidating, too uncomfortable. Many of us struggle with that. So I would jump for a conclusion which might have been premature or based off unsound observations or deductions. And I would just present it. And sometimes my perception was a little bit warped because I had biases that I wasn't aware of. My experience was shaped by my neurodivergence, and I have a very unique point of view as a result of my neurodivergence. And I might have not had all the facts. I might have thought I had all the facts. And again, this is a universal human challenge. A lot of us do that. But I would get very locked in my perspective or perception, and I would be willing to debate it. But because I was so firm in my initial statement, and because I was ready to engage in a debate about it, people could get a little bit intimidated or uncomfortable or assume I was already locked into this perspective and not willing to change. The fact was, I was willing, and I knew I had blind spots, but being made aware of those blind spots, like most people, I would get defensive. It could trigger my rejection sensitivity, and I would shut down and feel stupid, and I didn't want to feel stupid because feeling stupid has been something I experienced growing up, being neurodivergent. So trying to exist in black and white and not in the gray was my way of protecting myself against being perceived in a defective or inferior way. And so the forcefulness with which I presented my statements was a byproduct of me trying to protect myself against perceived rejection, bullying, mockery, or exclusion. However, to other people seeing me being so assertive, so confident in my point of view, which could often be very subjective and have some flawed observations, that could be quite off-putting to them, and they would not want to engage, and I would not always get the feedback that I needed to readjust my perspective and have a more balanced view of things. And I want to stress here that this is, again, a universal challenge. You don't have to be neurodivergent to have it, but I know that it was acute in my experience until I got diagnosed and developed a bit more self-awareness and was aware that I did this. And self-awareness becomes the first defense for many neurodivergents navigating an ableist neurotypical world where we have to kind of live with one foot in both worlds, trying to understand our own authentic self and how we want to express ourselves, and then navigate social expectations of us by neurotypicals. And then to some extent conforming as part of a social appeasement strategy so that our social relations can be relatively successful, adjusting our behavior so that we can fit within their mold. And it can be very constraining at times. I acknowledge that. An example I want to give you of me having made a statement that I knew was an opinion but was presented as a fact and being very insensitive about it was I had a friend from a different culture. I heard the language that she spoke when she was with her family. And I made a statement, I can't remember the exact statement, that to Western ears, it sounds kind of raucous, the accent or the pronunciation. Very insensitive. Even the term raucous, I didn't see it as derogatory, but that was how I heard it as a Westerner because language sounds different. Different languages sound different. She heard it as a slight and as an attack, and I can see now in hindsight why she heard it that way. And it was kind of one of those socially dumb but blunt observations that didn't really add anything, was not necessary. I didn't need to make it. And I didn't even realize the impact it was going to have because I thought I was making a statement of fact. Again, it was subjective. It was my hearing, how I perceived the language to sound. And it was also perceived in a social environment in which this person felt marginalized as a racial minority, an ethnic minority. And she felt that she was being criticized, or her culture was being made fun of, or she was being, in some ways, treated derogatorily. And I didn't intend that whatsoever. To me, I was like, oh, I was just making as I perceived it to be, making conversation. But the insensitivity with which I made that statement, which was, again, unnecessary, really riled her up, and she got angry and snapped at me. And I was like, why are you getting so offended? Like, I was just making a factual based observation, and I didn't have any subjective value attached to it. Like, I wasn't devaluing the language. I wasn't devaluing how it sounded. It was just my subjective interpretation. And that was the beginning of the end of that relationship, because statements like this, my social obliviousness because of my autism, rubbed her the wrong way, and enough of those incidents tipped her over into anger and fury at me, and she didn't want to associate with me afterwards. Now, I mean, in an ideal world, we could talk it out, and she could give me some feedback, and I could take it on and then repair. And she could also maybe take on a different perspective and assume I wasn't trying to insult her, or her culture. In an ideal world, we can kind of repair that rupture, and it could be a learning experience for me as an autistic person to be like, oh yeah, now I see your point of view. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. Not that it is the emotional or cognitive labor of people who are marginalized to have to do that work always. But as my friend, I hope that at least we could patch it up and work through it. I didn't necessarily have the skills to work through it at the time. And that's one example of how I've struggled as a neurodivergent, but I've noticed that this tendency to present statements that are actually opinions as fact does happen among neurotypicals. So, for example, when we commit these social faux pas and they become offended, they respond in a way that is judgmental. They imply that there is a character deficiency or moral deficiency on our behalf because we said or did something socially inappropriate, or we didn't meet their social expectations. And they might not state it outright, but their reactions are often, this is objectively the reality, you are a terrible person. So it is a universal human trait, and I'm not going to let neurotypicals off the hook here. I want to acknowledge that this does happen with them, and it does happen to us, but I know that that is something I've struggled with. Have you had this challenge in social situations where you've presented something and it was an opinion, but it was interpreted as a fact, or you presented it as a fact knowing that it was an opinion, and it was led to some hurt feelings, somebody being offended, somebody getting upset, somebody misperceiving your intention and then reading the wrong thing out of that and making a judgment about you? I would love to hear all about your experiences.